Hello, everyone. My name is Kenda Neal Soto. I work here at NAVFAC Exwick in Port Hueneme, California, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending today's Open Environmental Restoration Resource webinar on CUI training for environmental restoration. Our speaker today will be Diane Silva from NAVFAC Southwest. Next slide. Diane is the NAVFAC Southwest Command Records Manager. She moved from the Defense Contract Audit Agency in NAVFAC in February of 1997 and received her National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, Records Management Certification in July of 2006. She has over 40 years experience as a federal records manager, processing Freedom of Information Act requests, and 26 years of experience assisting the Navy Litigation Office and DOJ identifying and providing documentation in support of Navy litigations. Today, Diane will be explaining what Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI, is, and how the CUI policy is applied to NAVFAC environmental restoration records, and what required document markings to use. At the end of today's presentation, we will also be having a Q&A. We highly recommend that you submit your questions throughout the presentation via our chat box. This presentation is also being recorded, and both the PowerPoint presentation and recording will be posted onto our public website. Following this webinar, a link will be available for a short survey. Please fill out this survey, as it is our main feedback mechanism and should take less than 2 minutes to complete. Next slide. I would like to emphasize this important disclaimer. This webinar is intended to be informational and does not indicate endorsement of a particular product or technology by the Department of Defense or NAVFAC Exwick. Although every attempt is made to provide the most accurate information, there is no guarantee that any technology or product will be suitable for your own site. Next slide. Okay, so before our speaker, Diane, begins her presentation, I would like to invite Nate DeLong from NAVFAC headquarters to say a few words about the OER2 webinars. Nate?
Hi, thank you, Kenda. Hello, everyone. My name is Nathan DeLong with NAVFAC headquarters. We at NAVFAC very much appreciate your participation in the Open Environmental Restoration Resource, or OER2 webinar series today. We have been providing this webinar series since about 2014 and look forward to providing another informative topic for the environmental restoration community. This webinar is for RPMs, RTMs, contractors, and anyone else who supports the Department of the Navy Environmental Restoration Program. Our goal is that this series will provide a venue for two-way communication, both from reaching out to and obtaining feedback from you all, the community members. The emphasis of the webinar series is to share information openly and to promote innovations among the environmental community. This is done via our Navy policies, guidance, tools, technologies, practices, initiatives, or lessons learned. We'd also like you to know that feedback from our environmental community members is absolutely key in sustaining this webinar series. So please feel free to recommend topics or to volunteer as presenters. Any topic which is considered should be relevant to the environmental restoration program and should not contain any marketing materials. If your topic is selected, you will be working with a Navy champion, and the community member may present the topic possibly with a Navy POC. So as Kenda mentioned, today's webinar is entitled Protecting Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI. And this is an extremely important topic for the environmental restoration program. One of the main reasons it's an important topic is the environmental restoration program actually by law needs to include the public and the community in the decision-making process according to CERCLA. So a lot of our documents need the proper CUI, need to be analyzed for CUI and need the proper markings for CUI in case there is something that should not be shared with the public. So this should be a good reason why everyone should have already heard about CUI, not only for that, but because it's also mandatory NAVFAC training for those of you who are NAVFAC RPMs or RTMs. And for anyone who is unfamiliar with it, then you are in luck because Diane will be teaching us all about the different types of CUI, when to use it, how to properly mark your documents, which documents need it, and so much more. And before we begin, I just wanted to also say thank you to Diane for volunteering to present this topic, as these OER2 webinars would not be possible with volunteers such as her. So with that, I'd like it to pass it over to Diane Silva with NAVFAC Southwest. So Diane, please take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Kenda. Thank you, Nate. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to go over what CUI is, the purpose, citations, the impact and responsibility of marking CUI documents, the CUI types, the registries, the various categories that are typically applicable to environmental restoration and other environmental program documents, the required markings, the requirements for drinking water wells on private residential property, limited dissemination controls, the CUI priority standard for NAVFAC, what happens if there are improper or missing CUI markings, dissemination to local and state regulatory agencies, and information about additional resources and training. So what is CUI? The CUI basically is information that is not classified, that allows for or requires safeguarding and dissemination controls in accordance with laws, regulations, or government-wide policies. Sensitive information that does not meet the criteria for classification but still requires protection. The CUI is not a level of classification such as confidential, secret, or top secret. It's not. We don't refer to it as information that is classified as CUI. The reference would be controlled as CUI. The purpose of the CUI program is to ensure standardization. In the past, there were various different markings that agencies used, and there was no standardization. It also provides a uniform marking system, and it's important to note that it does replace for official use only, or FOUO. The instruction on CUI specifically states that FOUO markings are no longer authorized on documents. Federal agencies routinely generate and share information with local and state agencies and partners. So it's important to identify CUI content in a document and mark the documents appropriately so that information isn't inadvertently shared. It protects information that doesn't meet the threshold of classified information, and it requires some level of protection to prevent unauthorized access or release. And the protection is required, again, under the privacy, law enforcement, or other reasons pursuant to laws, regulations, or government-wide policy. The DoD instruction 5200.48 is the instruction for controlled unclassified information issued in 2020, and it establishes the policy and assigns responsibility and procedures pursuant to Executive Order 13556, the CFR and the DFAR sections noted on slide number 8. It also established the official DoD CUI registry. DoD instruction 5230.24 is the instruction on distribution statements as updated or reissued in January of 2023. I mention it here because Distribution statements are not eliminated. CUI markings do not replace a distribution statement. And it's also important to remember that it is possible to have a restricted distribution statement on a document that does not contain CUI. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The impact and responsibility of CUI is that the authorized holder or document creator is responsible for determining at the time of creation whether a document contains information that falls within one or more CUI categories as identified in the CUI registry. The authorized holder or document creator is responsible for applying the CUI markings and the dissemination instructions. Contractors work together with their NAVFAC project managers or the remedial project managers. And there's also a non-disclosure agreement template for CUI, which is great to include in your contracts as RPMs, writing your scopes. Although it's optional, DoD strongly recommends the use of a non-disclosure agreement and increases standardization across the organizations and the contract, and templates are available in the resources. Every individual, per the DoD instruction 5200.48, is required to take the annual training. DoD, civilian personnel, military, and contractors as well. There are two types of CUI categories or designations. There is the basic and the specified. The basic category is a subset of categories which laws, regulations, or government-wide policies do not require a specific handling or dissemination control. The specified carries the same categories and the rules for laws, regulations, or government-wide policies. However, when it's a specified category, the dissemination controls are identified based on a specific citation that requires limited access to certain information or a document. For specified, the authority defines, or the citation defines, what the handling control is, requires a unique marking, and enhanced safeguards. It limits who can access the information, and the difference in the marking would be if it is a specified category, it would begin with the characters or letters SP and then the actual category, CUI category. In this example, it would be budget information. And again, CUI specified is not a higher level of a CUI category. It basically just defines what dissemination controls are supposed to be included based on the applicable citation. There are two CUI registries. The CUI registry is a list of indices, categories, and descriptions of the type of information that must be identified as CUI. The registry includes the CUI markings, also identifies the limited dissemination control, or LDCs, provides additional training and resources. The National Archives and Records Administration CUI registry, or NARA, is the lead agency for the CUI program. However, the DoD registry, the categories are the same, except that the DoD identified various categories based on aligning the index with DoD issuances. You can reference either one, but it's important to continue referencing the websites because unfortunately there is no way to sign up for updates. They just don't do that. It should be important to note that I update and review the CUI registries on a regular basis and do update the Environmental Restoration Record Keeping Manual if there are any changes that would apply to environmental documents. Here's a basic, I took this from the websites, what typically you would see. And these categories are typical categories for environmental documents. We have archaeological resources, we have general critical infrastructure, and you'll notice here that these are basic rather than specified. The CUI marking is the acronym that would be included in the actual marking on the document, and the websites provide a very good description of what's covered or included in that particular category. We also have DCRIT, which is DoD critical infrastructure. That one is a little bit different in that the general critical infrastructure would be something like utilities or active water treatment plants, drinking water wells, that sort of thing. The DCRIT is a critical infrastructure or information that, excuse me, that the Secretary of Defense specifically covers in a written determination. And without that written determination, if you have something that's considered critical infrastructure under the general, then your category would be CRIT. In this case, if it's a written determination by the Secretary of Defense, it would be DCRIT. Excuse me. Health information, this is specific or specified, and so this carries specific dissemination controls for this kind of information. We do see health information when we see certifications from medical physicians certifying that an individual is cleared or healthy for PPE. It's rare, but you need to watch for that because there is this type of information. Historic properties is also specified. Privilege contractors wouldn't necessarily see this on a regular basis, but if you have information provided from counsel, then these documents would be or should be marked appropriately. And then, of course, we have the privacy information or PII, and then proprietary information. Proprietary information for the restoration community would be contractor or laboratory standard operating procedures, SOPs. A lot of them will mark them as company or business confidential. And so this category would be applicable. If you go to the ER record keeping manual, Appendix G provides a more comprehensive list of information, and the table in that appendix also includes the applicable citations that apply to environmental to help you determine distribution statements and distribution categories. Drinking water wells on private residential property, that would be considered critical infrastructure. Per the ASD memo dated in August 2023, and consistent with Section 344 of the National Defense Authorization Act, sample data is releasable and is not considered CUI. However, the names and addresses will not be released because this information is CUI. It's personally identifiable information, and it will be covered under the CUI category of privacy. Also, the latitude and longitude of the sampling locations are considered CUI, and again, would be considered the category of PII. The information of the names and addresses, latitude, longitude, actually latitude and longitude, not necessarily names and addresses, is not releasable without prior authorization from the property owner, or referred to as the right of entry agreement. The ASD memo includes language for the agreement to be sent to the private property owner. That documentation whether the property owner approves release or just approves or allows access to the property will be maintained in the official record file as a site file document, and it would be marked as CUI for personally identifiable information. Required CUI markings, the minimum requirement, the DoD instruction on CUI allows agencies a couple of options, but the Navy option or requirement is to use the acronym only on CUI only documents. And what I mean by that is if you have a document that has a combination of CUI and classified, whether it's confidential, secret, or top secret, you would not mark those documents at CUI. But typically there are no, I'm not aware of any restoration documents that are classified. But it's important to note that when the document contains controlled unclassified information only, then the CUI marking will be included in the header and the footer. And to be sure is that CUI markings are not applied to a document because we don't want anyone else to have access to it. That is not a reason. If there is no content in a document that fits into one or more of the CUI categories, then marking the document as CUI is not appropriate, and agencies are prohibited from doing that. We'll add the CUI in the banner or header and footer of the first or cover page of the document and on each page containing the controlled information. Distributions are required on all documents. Again, a restrictive distribution statement does not mean it has to be marked as CUI. CUI markings are not required if the document does not contain CUI information or content. Distribution statements apply to all documents, whether they're classified, controlled unclassified, or unclassified. For official use only, again, is no longer authorized on documents. They will not be accepted. CUI markings are required on all documents that contain CUI and on each page containing the CUI content. The designation indicator block is also included on the first page. I have samples and a few slides coming up. But the designation indicator block is on the cover page or the first page only. There are 5 required lines for the indicator block. The first line would be the DoD component making the determination. So that would be Department of the Navy for us. If it's a letter on company letterhead or Navy or BRAC letterhead, then that first line can be eliminated. The second line would be the office. So it would either be NAVFAC Southwest, NAVFAC Atlantic, the BRAC PMO West office. It would be the specific office. Line 3 identifies all the types of CUI categories included in that document, and they must be listed alphabetically. So in the previous slide that included the abbreviations, those would be the categories marked in that block. Line 4 is either a distribution statement or a dissemination control. Typically, the distribution statement letter is used, I would say, probably 95% of the time, maybe more. But a dissemination control or limited dissemination control identifier is to be used if you have a specified CUI category, such as the health information, as an example. And then the last line would be, according to the instruction, it's phone number or office email. The NAVFAC established a command-specific group email, which is included in Table 3 of Appendix G. So the instruction requires agencies to maintain an active contact on a cover page in that dissemination block. So if John Smith is the RPM today and retires next year, that document no longer has a point of contact. So please use the command-specific email for the documents that are being prepared and marked. Here's an example of a letter where you would include CUI markings. Again, the CUI acronym in the header above the letterhead, and then at the bottom. The CUI follows the distribution statement at the bottom, and then the designation indicator block is included below the signature. If you have a multi-page correspondence where the signature block is 2 or 3 pages in or more, you are required to leave space on the first page to enable adding the header and the footer, the distribution statement, and the designation indicator block. All CUI categories must be listed in alphabetical order. As you can see here in this example, budget comes before privacy. It's also important to note that the absence of a limited dissemination control does not mean that it is authorized or approved for public release. It's according to the instruction, only authorized lawful government purpose authorizes personnel, contractor, and or government personnel to have access to that document. However, all documents need to be reviewed prior to release. The distribution statement or dissemination controls. So if you're listing the distribution statement, the full distribution statement is below. And then in the designation indicator block, it would be distribution statement and just the letter B in this example. Here's an example of a NAVFAC report cover page. Again, it's the same thing. CUI above the NAVFAC logo, and at the bottom, distribution statement, and then the designation indicator block. It's important also to understand that a transmittal letter or related correspondence to a report that is marked CUI does not necessarily have the same marking or distribution statement. Most NAVFAC transmittal letters will not have a distribution statement. So you review a document individually and independently of each other. So a transmittal letter, for example, for this document, that states, here's your copy, please provide your comments within a certain date. That does not contain any CUI information, but the report itself would contain the markings if that document contains CUI content. NAVFAC does not practice or will not accept portion markings on CUI only documents. I only mention it here because if you happen to have a document that contains both CUI and classified information, then CUI markings are not appropriate and portion marking would be required. For CUI only documents, if you mark the document with portions, every paragraph, subject line, title, section, figures, tables would have to be marked as CUI for the paragraph or section that includes CUI, and unclassified with a U for everything that isn't. Although it's required on commingled information, classified and CUI, NAVFAC is not doing that. Please note that documents will be returned if there are portion markings on a CUI only document. Here's just an example. If you have correspondence, this is what it would look like, and you'll notice that the subject and each paragraph is marked as CUI or unclassified. It's a lot of work. Consider, a multi-thousand page document and having to go through and marking that document at every section, paragraph, and so on. You don't want to do that. Emails also require CUI markings if the attachment or the body of the email includes information that contains controlled unclassified information. The subject line would be marked. There would be a banner and a footer, or a header and a footer. That would be the first line of the email and the last line of the email. If the body of the email does not contain the CUI content, but the attachment does, the subject line includes CUI regardless, but there would be no need to include CUI in the header and the footer of the email. The attached file name must include CUI. It's best to begin the file name with CUI, and also that document, the attachment, would be marked as required with the designation indicator block. The email would also include the designation indicator block at the bottom, if the body of the email includes that information. And then portion markings are also optional on CUI only emails, but remember that if you do it that way, every paragraph must be marked as such. Email or transmittal of that document must be sent encrypted to all recipients. You can use DoD Safe with encryption if you need to transmit a document to a non-government email or non.mil email. Here's an example of what an email would look like. Again, the subject line has CUI, the first line, the last line of the email has CUI, and here's the designation indicator block. I've seen some emails lately. This is placed at the bottom right of the email, but I've seen emails where the indicator block is left justified with CUI below the block, and that's fine. CUI markings are also required on all electronic media, computers, CDs, DVDs, external removable hard drives, thumb drives. We don't use thumb drives, or not authorized on NMCI computers, but contractors may use it between themselves throughout their corporation, and it's important to let them know that they need to mark that as well. There are standard forms 902 and 903. These are what the labels look like. They are self-adhesive and can be applied to the media. One thing I wanted to mention is that if you're creating CDs or DVDs, just include the markings in the text of the primary label that you adhere to the disc on top. If you add an additional label, we found that it throws off the balance of the disc in the disc reader and they become unreadable. So it's not a good idea to affix an additional label onto a CD, and it's best to mark the disc itself and not just the case, because they can be separated. I apologize for the size of this slide. For limited dissemination controls, this is also available in Appendix G of the record keeping manual, and these are some of the or the LDCs for the various categories or dissemination control. When using DL only, which is the dissemination list, it's a controlled dissemination list, this would be applicable for a document that it requires to be marked with a distribution statement F, as in Frank. If you're sharing or distributing a document outside the federal government, statements B as in boy and C as in Charlie no longer apply to local and state government agencies. So be sure that you're using statement F and include a dissemination list. When you're creating your dissemination list and you're identifying the distribution, be sure to use the office name, group, or organization, and do not use a specific individual. According to the CUI instruction, the DoD instruction, When you're listing an individual on a dissemination list, it is strictly limited to the names or organizations listed on that list. So if you need to send something, as an example, to DTSC, and your counterpart, is John Smith, and you're sending it to him, just identify DTSC and the address of that office. Because if John Smith leaves, authorization to retain that document does not transfer to the group, office, or organization. So it's very important to understand the difference. Doesn't mean you can't. It just means that know that if you're putting an individual's name on the list, it's authorized to that specific individual only. You can put it in the mail to John Smith. You can email it to John Smith, but identify the organization only. So when deciding on whether or not, or determining whether or not information, CUI content is in the document, there's a real push to be able to make as many of our documents available to the public without requiring all the special handling. So this priority should be the rule to follow or consider before issuing that document. The first would be to eliminate the CUI information. If it's not required to be in the document, eliminate it. Don't redact it from the original or primary document. Just don't include it. And the redacted version may be required by the contract or your NAVFAC project manager. The other option would be, if the information is required, ask whether or not it can be modified so that the information is no longer CUI. Sometimes that's possible, and we've done that in the past. And then if the first two are just not possible, then you retain the information. And then know that CUI markings are required, and a restrictive distribution statement is also required. The other thing I want to make sure that everyone understands is that per headquarters council, no personal information or contact information is included or to be included in a document. So if you've got personal cell phone numbers, don't put that in there. Put your official phone number and your official office address. Company addresses, company phone numbers are not considered CUI. Your official office address and your desk phone number is not CUI. Improper or missing CUI markings. So the DoD instruction or the SecNav instruction requires, excuse me, that senior leaders, contracting officers, commanders, and supervisors at all levels must consider and take appropriate administrative, legal, or other corrective or disciplinary action to address CUI misuse or unauthorized disclosure commensurate with the appropriate law, regulation, or government-wide policy. So that's the disclaimer right there. That's right out of the instruction. So there are consequences for either no CUI markings or improper markings. Potential CUI spillage could garner legal, administrative, or disciplinary action. Unnecessary restriction to information by program partners. Document is returned to the submitter or creator for correction. Please know that the records management personnel and teams will return the document if the markings are not correct. Requires, if corrections are required, it would require redistribution to all the original recipients, which may or may not incur document reprinting costs. We've transitioned to paperless for documents dated 1 March 25 and beyond. It's my understanding from some of our local RPMs that some regulatory agencies or recipients want a paper copy. If that's what they want, that's what they want. But, just know that corrections are required to be redistributed. It also delays document uploads to NIRIS and public access if it's a public document. And then it does impact contract closeout. So it's important that if you're not sure, reach out to your records management personnel. They are very well versed in CUI. They know what the markings are, what the requirements are. So if you're not sure, it's best to please work with your RPMs and your records management personnel before dissemination. So the other question that came up in lately is dissemination to local and state regulatory agencies. What do you do with a document where it does contain CUI? You can't eliminate it. You can't modify the information. How do you want to provide those documents to the partners to be able to get comments and be able to issue the document? So what we've done is provide the regulatory agencies with a redacted copy only. That doesn't work all the time. It's my understanding that some commands or teams have considered reviewing the CUI document in person with the regulator. In this case, the document would be made available for the individual's review, but not retained by the regulator. That may not be efficient and may not be something that's available, but know that that would be okay. If providing the CUI document to regulators, you may not be able to send an encrypted email, but the transmission must be encrypted. The file name must include CUI. It would be an example of a file name that you might send out to a regulatory agency. Transmitting documents that cannot be sent using an encrypted email. DoD Safe is approved for CUI, PII, and PHI file exchange. It is not approved for contract solicitation or proposal submission. And it's not approved for classified information. So if you've got a document that includes both CUI and classified, sending an encrypted DoD Safe transmission is not appropriate and not authorized. And do not transmit to an email address that is a mailbox or a group distribution. Because there's no guarantee that only authorized holders would receive that CUI content. So you can email to an individual, but don't send to a group email. For those of you who haven't seen the DoD Safe file drop-off, this is a screenshot of what it looks like, and the yellow highlighted areas are where you would click to encrypt a file. So you would encrypt every file included in the transmission. If only one file is CUI and the others are not, you would have to send the transmission encrypted. And then you also, as the sender, have to confirm that the upload does not contain classified information, that you are aware that the organization, our organization, will be held accountable if we're sending information that's CUI and we haven't encrypted it, or we're sending it classified information through DoD Safe. Here's some resources. Waypoints training for NAVFAC and BRAC employees is annual training required on CUI. It's due in January. Contractors don't have access to this link. However, there is a transcript that can be provided. Today's topic would also be covered as CUI training. The NARA CUI registry webpage has training. The DoD CUI registry has training and resources and additional information. But when you go to the NARA site, be sure that you're following the NAVFAC standards because the NARA website provides all optional information on how agencies can mark their documents as far as using acronyms for CUI versus spelling out controlled unclassified information. So the training is good, but just be sure that you go back to the NAVFAC resources for the actual markings. And then we can find the CUI labels. They're available on GSA for government agencies, and then they're also available commercially at cuisupply.com. Additional training, we've had our standard annual records management webinars. This year they were in April and May, but they are available on the link below on this slide. How and when to identify CUI. CUI requirements, distribution statements, the FOIA exemptions, and submitting electronic documents, the form and PDFs through NIRIS is available. The presentations are there as well as the recordings. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Diane. Excellent job. We've been collecting questions for you that have been submitted through the chat, and I'd like to get to those now. So
sure.
Here, thank you. Here we go. First question we have is, let's see, emails marked as CUI and encrypted can't be sent to contractors. Is there another option via email for sending this information to them other than DoD safe?
Not that I'm aware of, and I'm not sure. Is this us sending to contractors? Is that what the question was? Sending to contractors?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of any other option. DoD Safe is the FTP site that we've been told to use. I know we've had issues with sending to contractors, so if I need to send something, I have to use DoD Safe and send it encrypted.
Okay, thank you. Next question, if I have a restrictive distribution statement, do I still need a CUI marking?
No. A restrictive distribution statement does not mean a CUI marking is required. An example would be RPM meeting minutes or BCT meeting minutes from the BRAC BCT meeting minutes, where regulatory agencies are typically included in those meetings. The regulatory agency may have a copy of those meeting minutes, but there may not be anything that's CUI in that document. So a restrictive statement is required in this case because it's going out to a regulator in this example. Then statement F would be required because that's the only authorized distribution statement. And the reason why we would mark BCT meeting minutes or RPM meeting minutes as restrictive with a restrictive distribution statement is because they are considered internal documents. We don't want them to be made available. So if you're including the regulatory agency on that distribution, you don't want the agency to post it on their public website. There is only a CUI marking if those meeting minutes include CUI content. So you have, they work in concert. Distribution statements and CUI markings work in concert with each other. But if there is no CUI content, there is no CUI marking, but there may be a restrictive distribution statement. If there is CUI markings required, then there must be a restrictive distribution statement.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are on-base groundwater monitoring wells considered CUI? If we receive a FOIA request, our FOIA officer could withhold information based on FOIA exemption number 9. Okay.
Within the boundaries of the installation, I know for the state of California, I think they're making those public now on their website. And it's my understanding that if the monitoring well in general is not CUI, but if it goes down to the water table, it would be considered CUI. And I'm gonna tag Nate. Nate, do I have that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Does that answer the question for the individual that asked?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a big difference between, right, the majority of our wells in our program are not going to be CUI, but production wells, things like that, yes, they will be CUI. But production wells are typically what we don't deal with those. Not always, but.
Okay, thank you. Thanks both of you. I have another question. Can I get a copy of the webinar presentation and the ER guide discussed in this presentation? And they put their email there, so we will be sure and get that for you. We have an address listed here.
Okay, so they're talking about this webinar and
Yes.
presentation? Okay.
Yeah, and they might have joined a little late, so we did mention that at the beginning. So we'll be sure, and I'll be sure and get their information, get
Okay,
that to them.
And can I interject also, just in case, this link here on slide 34 is also accessible if you have a NIRIS account to get the Environmental Restoration Record Keeping Manual and access to all of the appendices, including Appendix G on CUI.
Okay, great. Thank you for adding that in. I know we probably have some NIRIS users on the phone too, so which is great. Okay, we're going to continue on. Next question, do groundwater wells screened in the same aquifer as a private drinking well require CUI?
Say that again?
Oh, do groundwater wells that are screened in the same aquifer as a private drinking well require CUI?
That's a good question. I'm thinking in the same aquifer may not be accessing private property. I'm going to tag Nate on this one as well. I would say no if you're not testing a well on private property.
Yeah, it's a question that it's the two separate wells, one private, one on base, that are in the same aquifer.
Mm-hmm. That's what that's how I'm understanding the question. I would say it depends on where you're testing.
Yeah, and is the one on base not a production well? If it's, yeah, I think it would depend as well.
So
sometimes it's tough to answer some of these questions without specifics, but
right.
But yeah, I think it would depend as well on the
Right.
location and what the well is being used for.
I would offer that when and if you get to that question on a project that you're working on and developing a document, is to work with your RPM. And if your RPM is not sure, then reach out to your records management team. Because sometimes, to answer a question in general, you have to have a little bit more information. I'm sorry about a non-answer, but it's hard to answer that in general, as a general question.
Yeah, okay. Let's continue on here, and I'm going to make a note on that question so we can address that or think about it some more. For RI plans and reports, please confirm we can't show off-base, OFF base, monitoring wells or any other media due to privacy? If so, how do we show a plume map and progress made?
Data and information visuals are okay and not CUI, but when you're labeling or tagging points on a figure or discussing location, with PII in the text, that would be CUI. So you can show points on a figure, but don't say this is, private well located at this longitude, latitude, or this is Mr. Smith's property. Figures, regardless of what it is, regardless of what type of critical infrastructure, you can talk about Site 7 all day long and not say what it is. You can talk about a building and not say the purpose of the building or function of the building, like active live storage of live munitions. Anything that's inactive or former is not CUI. If it's active, then it may be CUI depending on what it is. So again, the idea is you don't want to identify private owners, names, addresses, longitude, latitude. If you show the installation's boundary on your figure and your sampling location or aquifer, goes outside the boundary, you can show that figure in such a way that it can't be identified as a private property. Does that make sense? And Nate, please jump in if you'd like.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the figures and stuff gets tricky if you have to go off base, right? And a good example that we have that we consistently put out there is the PFAS sampling fact sheets, where we have an area of sampling that's an extremely general figure that shows a general area of where we'll be sampling, but doesn't identify any particular properties. Additionally, I think anytime you go off base and you have to show figures, I think that's an instance where you're going to need to have two different copies of the same report, right? You're going to need, especially if you're talking like something like a plume, a specific plume for a site or contaminant, where that CUI version report will have like the actual plume and some more details to that figure. And then the one that goes out into the administrative record, it's going to have a different figure. It's just going to be more general, not show as much.
Okay.
As much as we advise to or tell everyone to look at potential for removing CUI from a report, sometimes it's just, you can't do it. It's just, you can't do it without and still properly. You can't remove that CUI without properly, or it makes it impossible to explain what's actually going on at the site.
Yeah, and when we say eliminate or modify, the question that you have to ask yourself is, if I eliminate this information or modify this information in such a way that it is no longer considered CUI, am I still able to convey the information or document the information that needs to be conveyed? And if the answer to that question is no, then it can't be eliminated and it can't be modified. Then it has to be marked as CUI. And if it has to go out to a regulatory agency, then the option would be to provide them a redacted version of that document. But the official record file, the admin record, should have the unredacted document in addition to the redacted one, so that we know what that information is.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of this webinar, and we do have some additional questions, and I want to thank all of you who submitted questions. Please feel free to email myself here or Diane or Nate after this webinar, and we will get you those questions answered for sure. So please follow up with us. As we wrap up, please take the survey that is linked in the chat. It should be very quick, and we appreciate your feedback. Also, look for future OER2s through the T2 email distribution. Hopefully all of you have that. If not, email me and I will get you added to the distribution. And also look for our OER2 presentations and recordings on the ERB website and YouTube page. So please check out those pages. Thank you again to Diane and Nate and all of you who have attended today, and we look forward to having you back next time. Thank you again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.